podcast where we talk to smart people, but not necessarily done by smart people?
That is an awesome question.
This one goes down probably on one of my top 5.
Hey, I like nutrition. I like to eat food.
This is the coolest thing ever. We're going to do this forever.
I wish I paid more attention in that class.
You know, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand that. As a man, I don't get it.
Welcome to smartpeoplepodcast.com.
Hello and welcome to Smart People Podcast, conversations that satisfy the curious mind. Happy holidays to you all, wherever you may be in the world. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to come join us on this episode of Smart People Podcast. We've got a great episode in store for you today, one that I thought, it's not a bad time right around the holiday season to air this one. This week on the show, we have a man named Lawrence Levy. Who is Lawrence? Well, Lawrence is a Silicon Valley lawyer. So you might not be hooked, but here's the thing. Not only did Lawrence found his own law firm in Silicon Valley and has played a major role in many of the well-known companies in the tech space, Lawrence was hired by none other than Steve Jobs in 1994 as the CFO of a little-known place at the time called Pixar Animation Studios. In fact, as the story goes, out of nowhere, Lawrence gets a call, and the person on the other line says, "Hi, this is Steve Jobs. I saw your picture in a magazine a few years ago and thought we'd work together someday." And that's how it began. And although that sounds crazy and something you would jump at right now, at the time, no one really knew about Pixar. Lawrence had a great job and was well respected in the industry, and this was really a risky thing to do. Well, as you can imagine, the story that unfolds is pretty fantastic. When Levy joined, he found Pixar on the verge of failure, and of course today, well, we know where Pixar is, and much of that is due to this man, Lawrence Levy. Lawrence is the author of a new book where you can hear this whole story, if you like this interview, and that book is called To Pixar and Beyond, My Unlikely Journey with Steve Jobs to Make Entertainment History. So we're going to get into this interview with Lawrence in a minute, but I want to pause for a minute, a moment of reflection. This is probably the last interview we will bring to you in 2016, and as always, the end of the year brings a unique time in Smart People Podcast, just in the fact that we look at where we've come, where we're going, the ups and the downs, and believe me, there's downs. And at the end, really, we just want to say thank you. Because yes, we're putting out the content, and yes, it takes a lot of time and all of that, and we hope you appreciate it. But thank you because we know you do appreciate it. And allowing us to be part of your day, wherever you are in the world, is what also allows us to have the honor to continue this show. So thank you, happy holidays, be safe, cherish your family, and enjoy this episode.
All right. Well, Lawrence, first I just want to say thank you so much for being on Smart People Podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Chris. I'm really happy to be here.
So, of course, we're having you on to discuss, amongst a few things, but primarily your brand new book, To Pixar and Beyond, My Unlikely Journey with Steve Jobs to Make Entertainment History. And the first thing I'm wondering or wanted to ask is, obviously, just putting Steve Jobs in the title and then furthering that by working with him, knowing him really well, is just such a draw. What is it? What do you think it is, knowing him, or however you want to take this? What is it about Steve Jobs that's going to help sell the book, help? It's just there's so much of a draw there. What is it?
Well, Steve, as you know, he's sort of the iconic entrepreneur of our generation. And, he ushered in he really ushered in, what we know today as the personal computing industry. This is going way back to the 1980s. And then he came back and he kind of, did it again in his second act at Apple. And so that's really rare. And the reason I wrote the book, really, or one of them, I would say, is that in so much of the information out there about Steve, especially after he tragically died, I began to feel that the Pixar part of the story was a bit of an afterthought. And I kept thinking to myself, but wait a minute, this part of the story is not only a great story, it's really important, and both to Pixar and to understanding Steve. And so that was one of my inspirations for writing it down.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that. People have so many assumptions about Steve Jobs, myself included. And now with movies and books and biographies and all that stuff, it just continues to carry on the myth. So let's take this time, because I don't want to spend a ton of time on Steve, although it will come up. But let's take this time. What do you think are some of the misconceptions out there that, as someone who worked directly with him for a long period of time, that you could clear up for the listeners?
Well, I'm not really sort of, commenting on other people's experiences.
Sure.
Steve. What I'm recounting is mine, which was a very close, collaboration. And my experience was one of sort of friendship and collaboration, and it was that from the get-go. And so everything we did together was a product of this collaborative dialogue that we had. And it wasn't him kind of like lording over, dictating how everything ought to be, which I think is sometimes his reputation out there. It just wasn't that at all. And so he's a very sort of passionate and intense person, and he has strong views on things, but that doesn't mean that you can't, have a great kind of collaboration and work with people. And I think much of the work we did, certainly the work we did at Pixar, and I think much of the work that happened later at Apple came out of that kind of collaboration. I think that's important to understand.
You are one of the only people I have spoken with, maybe the only, and probably will be one of the only, that was not just a colleague of Steve, but really worked with him, knew him, was around him quite often. So what I want to ask is, being around him, working with him, was it clearly noticeable that he was a step above the majority in terms of ability and intelligence and his entrepreneurial mind?
I guess I would answer that. I think I would say he was a cut above. He had an extraordinary mind. He was the kind of person that, in a heartbeat could absorb a large and complex amount of information very quickly, digest it at lightning speed, and come back to you, with ideas and thoughts about it that would kind of push it to another level. So there was no way to be around Steve without being, really sort of invigorated by sort of the rigor of his mind. He was really good.
Well, that is good to know. It does make me feel better for some reason, just knowing, hey, some people are born with that perhaps, and that's okay.
Yeah, maybe it is. But, I think, there's always a little bit of luck in everything,
Sure.
Luck and timing and the people. So, I'm certainly, and my book sort of recounts this a little bit, I think we often give the mantle of success to sort of one person, and, this person did it all. And one of the themes in the book is it doesn't happen like that. It takes a village to make an animated feature film or build a company or make a great product. And so there's usually a lot more credit to go around than meets the eye. But that said, some of the people in the center of that, like Steve Jobs, it's no accident.
So we've talked a little bit about it, and I'll mention it in the intro, but I read about the story on how you came to work with Steve. And so tell us a little bit about the beginning of that relationship and why you think he picked up the phone in the first place.
Well, as you know from the book, and this is where the story begins in the book, is it literally begins with a phone call. Imagine I'm sitting in my office in a Silicon Valley company called Electronics for Imaging, a company that I joined as a startup. We'd taken it public. I've been there for a few years. And then my phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's Steve on the other end of the line. And he says, "Hey, Lawrence, it's Steve Jobs. And I saw your picture in a magazine a couple of years ago. I thought we might work together someday. I have this little company I want to tell you about." And this is 1994. And so I'm thinking this is about Next Computer, which was the company he founded after Apple. But Next had shut down its hardware business. As far as most people knew, it was not succeeding. And so I thought that maybe he wants to turn around next. And then he goes, the company's name is Pixar. And inside, I'm kind of going, what's Pixar? And outwardly, I kind of go, yeah, I'd love to learn about that. And that's how it all got started. The funny thing is that, you think about that now and you think, wow, what an amazing phone call. That's like the great Steve Jobs is calling him about the great Pixar. But this is 1994 and nothing could have been further from that. That's why the first chapter is called Why Would You Want to Do That? Because at that moment in time, it's probably the lowest point of Steve's career. People were sort of writing him off. He'd had a string of failures. He hadn't had a hit for a long time. And no one had really heard of Pixar. This was sort of known as the graphics company that Steve lost a lot of money in, but never really went anywhere. And so that was the scenario right then when he called.
Now, how did he find you? How did he even know who you were? How did that work?
I think he had read about me. There'd been some article in a magazine, and then I'm pretty sure he checked me out with some other people, and so that's how he found me. There's in Silicon Valley, you kind of like call around and you find it, and you can check people out.
And do you think, obviously Steve did, what was it about your background that made you the candidate for this undertaking, turning Pixar around?
Well, he never really told me, so I'm speculating here. But I had a reputation in Silicon Valley as sort of being very creative about strategically structuring how companies might function and how deals might get created. Because I had founded the technology transactions group at Silicon Valley's biggest law firm, and so I spent a number of years working with a lot of startups, creatively trying to craft transactions and business relationships that had never been done before. And I also had a financial background. And so I think he must have felt that those two things were going to be important if Pixar was going to turn into anything. It was pretty rare for a lawyer that had been doing that kind of transaction to become a CFO. So I had kind of a fairly unique skill set.
That makes sense. So, yeah, but I was thinking the same thing. I don't really put law and finance necessarily, especially CFO, in the same bucket.
That's right. But there are certainly, Silicon Valley, sort of has these pretty unique, maybe even somewhat esoteric law practices that relate to the high-tech industry. And so the one that I was doing was a very business-oriented. It required to understand the businesses of my companies, and I had, spent a lot of time with founders and CEOs crafting ways for them to, sort of break into new markets and that kind of stuff. So it was kind of like very businessy, if you think of it that way.
Well, let's see. I'm trying to think where to go with this. While we're on that subject of, like you said, founding the most successful at the time. I don't know if it still is. You could tell us, but law firm in Silicon Valley, which we all know about that. Learning so much there. What would be your first kind of piece of advice on anyone who's looking to perhaps they have a small company or they have a larger company, they're looking to, go public or really transition? How do you approach that, and how did you with so many other founders?
The law firm is still around, by the way. It's the Wilson Sonsini law firm, and I didn't found the firm. I found this department. It was a brand new department in the field of law around the time.
Okay.
And it's hard to generalize on that. I can tell you that when I joined Pixar, and one of the reasons that I joined is because I felt that I had a very complementary talent, capability to what was there already. So you had like John Lasseter, the brilliant storyteller and animator, Ed Catmull, brilliant technologist, and you had all these other brilliant people doing technology and storytelling. They had nobody there that really knew anything or understood business strategy, how to grow a company. And what that creates is a sort of tension, if you will. So there's a tension between these things, between, say, the business imperatives and creative imperatives. And all companies have these kinds of tensions. And so what I found is that the ones that worked kind of knew how to work out those tensions, and that requires a team of people that are sort of checks and balances and helping each other. And getting the sort of having the chemistry for that kind of team is not easy to acquire, and you have to be very patient to sort of assemble a team that knows how to manage and work through those kinds of pressures within a company. And if you look at many of the companies that have made it, you'll see that somehow they got there. Somehow they managed to work through and get good people to work together, even though they were sometimes pulling in different directions.
Yeah, I love how you put that. There's the business imperatives versus, but versus the creative imperatives. And I could see that in a lot of startups, having worked for a few and knowing you have those that are really about the vision, and then the other side, often those, and they can be in the financial or legal department, who know there are business decisions here that have to be made if we want to turn those creative ideas into a reality.
Exactly. And this exploring that, even though the book, I'm telling the story, but exploring that theme is a sort of very important in that story.
Right. Well, let's get into it. So what was Pixar? When Steve called you, because I didn't know before you were making Finding Nemo, I had no idea what Pixar was.
When Steve called me, I'm not sure anybody knew what Pixar was. I'm not even sure Pixar knew what Pixar was. Pixar was a sort of a collection of technologies. It started out to be a graphics company making very high-end graphics. It built an imaging computer called the Pixar imaging computer that it shut down in the early 1990s. So it had amazing technology for animation, and it had amazing technology for rendering high-end computer images. So to that end, it was a technology company. It also had made these short films, and it was making this little film called Toy Story. To that end, it had a lot of creative things going on. And so, you could ask at that time, you could have asked 10 different people, and you would have got 10 different answers about what Pixar was. And so part of the challenge was to really put a stake down and figure out what it was.
So you come in and you said yes. You said, Steve, I'll come work with you. What happened from there? I'd love to know, what was, in your opinion, I'm assuming you gather all this information. Did you create with him a vision of what we now know is Pixar? Or was it kind of, we're going to make this slight tweak and then iterate on it? How did that happen?
Oh, it was definitely the first one of what you said. It was a very deliberate, crafted strategy, and we worked that out over a period of time, back and forth, examining it both qualitatively and quantitatively. I mean, it was kind of a surprise, for example, to sort of come to the conclusion that Pixar was going to be an entertainment company. No one thought of Pixar as an entertainment company, not even Pixar really. And because, it would have been, when I went in there, I thought, it's got all this great technologies and it's doing this thing called Toy Story. Maybe we build a company that is like, got some technology business that are offsetting the risks of this entertainment thing. And what I figured out when I was in there was that none of these things had really any hope at all, which was not an easy conclusion to come to, and a huge downer in terms of my career. And there was a point where I thought I made a huge mistake going to Pixar. But we really crafted this to come up to that conclusion.
Would you say, here's what shocks me. I was always under the impression that Steve Jobs was an extremely focused person, in that, even at Apple, okay, we can go all of these directions, call it with the iPod, right? We can go all these directions, but we know that the iPod is going to be the way to go in order to get where we need to be, and we're going to focus on that. And then reading your book, it seems like there wasn't a lot of focus at Pixar until really, I think you came in, you brought that business knowledge, and you guys collaborated to create that focus. Is that true? And if so, what was it that was really lacking there where Steve couldn't focus on what was going to be most profitable?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So I would say kind of yes and no to that one. On the one hand, I think Pixar exists at all because of the kind of incredible focus that Steve had. And in that sense, I would say, he put $50 million into that company, which, as a sort of a venture capital investment kind of thing, especially, in the early 1990s, was virtually unheard of. And I think the reason he did that was because he really didn't do a lot of things, but the things that he did do, he stuck with. So Pixar was only one of a couple of things that he did after he left Apple originally, and he stuck with it. I think it was painful, and I think there were times that he wanted to get out of it, but rather than sort of put it down or let it go out of business, he stuck with it. So that in that sense, because he was focused on such few things, he stuck with it. But also at the same time, because his main day-to-day focus had been Next Computer, he was a bit of an absentee landlord at Pixar. And so it had drifted a lot over the years, and they tried different things, but never really made anything stick. And so when I came on board, that was a time within Pixar to really begin to hone the strategy and focus in on what it was going to be.
I really want to learn a little bit about how this strategy came to be, because in my mind, that's one of the core stories behind the story. And it's also something that I think can be translated to many different industries, so people listening can learn on how to do this. And it's a skill set of yours. So take us through first how this essentially this business plan came about with Pixar. And what I'm really wondering is, could you envision it becoming what it is? Was that really the goal? And now you look at it and you say, yeah, that's what we saw. And then how? What got you there?
So we did see that exact vision, but much of the story is about what got us there, because I think that's the important part. And so when I got into Pixar, I realized that, I was sort of like in a world, a terrain that I didn't understand. And so the first thing that I did was basically nothing. I literally told everyone, I asked permission actually. I said, all I want to do is sort of follow people around and see what they're doing. And I did that for a while. I did that for like a few weeks. I had like a notepad, and, the company was desperate for money. Steve was paying the shortfall in payroll out of his personal checkbook. And so he wanted things to happen quickly. And I was like, it'll happen, but not on the first day, not even in the first month, because I need to understand what's going on here. So the first thing is I literally was following around John Lasseter, Ed Catmull, all those guys, and just watching what they were doing and starting to understand the company. So that's the first thing, is to really take time to understand a company. And sometimes we rush to conclusions. We want to arrive somewhere and we want to act quickly and show how much we can do. But sometimes it's better to just sit back for a while and enjoy a little honeymoon period while you begin to understand what's going on within a company. And that process revealed a lot of kind of, cracks in the armor, so to speak. And then I started to look at the different things within Pixar, both the businesses, the culture, the challenges within the company. And then I started to figure out, wow, like this isn't going to work. That isn't going to work. And so in some ways, there were moments there where I sort of began to lose hope because I couldn't see anything that would work. And then, slowly this notion of what about animated feature films as a business? And so we started to examine that, start to learn about it because I didn't understand it. So Steve and I started shuttling back and forth to Hollywood as we learned what that business was all about. And that, in a way, didn't make matters better, because if you looked at the animated feature film business, you could see that no company pretty much ever had succeeded in building an independent animated feature film company. Not even Disney, because Disney got started in that in 1939 with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and then they had Dumbo and Bambi. But after a few years, he realized he couldn't kind of keep that animation engine going financially. And so he started to diversify Disney. And that's how we get into Buena Vista Distribution. And we get, Disney goes into television, it goes into movies, it goes into theme parks. So before you know it, you've got this incredibly diversified company. So no one had attempted to sort of build an independent animated feature film company. But that was the strategy that emerged. And it's a little bit like, if you only have one shot, if you're in the middle of a big storm and there's only one path out of it, no matter how risky that path is, that's your path.
Yeah, and as you talk about that, there's so many things there, obviously, that relate to startups, but I think can relate to everyone. And that first is this idea of you felt like maybe you would lose hope. There was, are we doing the right thing? There's so much uncertainty. And you've seen it not just in Pixar, I'm sure, but in the other people you worked with in your law firm. How do you deal with that? And how did Steve deal with that? Or did he even ever have doubt? Because sometimes it seems like he's too good for that.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say he's too good for that. I mean, I think it's a process. I think what happens is that the place where you slip up is like you come up, you do this whole assessment, right? So the end of that assessment is telling you, okay, we got to shut down all these other things. There's a group that's making animated commercials. There's a group that's selling this render-man software out there to all these companies. And we have to focus this company exclusively on animated entertainment. And that's a crazy bet that no one is going to believe that we can pull off. So you're sitting there facing that. And the thing it takes at that moment is a lot of courage, because there's a lot of momentum to sort of try to do everything, to try to hedge your bets, and to try to say, well, wait a minute, we don't want to shut down the commercials group. Maybe that'll be fine, and we want to keep selling this software. And so what you do is you fall into the trap of doing too much. And one of the things that any startups, or really any kind of work, if you want to do great work or great innovation, you have to focus. And that can be sort of scary. And I think the thing about Steve and myself is that we weren't afraid to kind of take those decisions, but I wouldn't say we did them without, sort of holding our breath sometimes, but we still went forward. We sort of trusted what we were learning.
In terms of building these roadmaps, or the roadmap you built at Pixar, and then again, you were known for that at your law firm, what do you recommend? Let's kind of stray from the business universe, but let's talk about just for your life, and therefore for everyone else's. We're often we're in this barrage of multiple decisions, and people are watching their social media. Are we going to make the right one? People are going to judge us about it. And I know we'll talk about a little bit later, Juniper Foundation, you do a lot of thinking around mindfulness, but what recommendations do you have for anyone, whether it be in their life or in their business, when they're struggling with multiple decisions, and how to find and create a good strategy to navigate, again, that life or business?
Well, it's obviously it depends on circumstances, but generally speaking, I would say something like pick something and go deeply into it, and don't worry so much that whether it's like the perfect thing. It's kind of like climbing a mountain. If you want to climb a mountain, you can't climb it by circling the bottom of the mountain, and you can't climb it by circling the bottom of the mountain and just testing the different ways up. You've got to pick a path and make your way to the top. And so what I say is climb a mountain, and because it's the experience of the climb. Even if it's not your perfect mountain, even if it's not exactly where you want to be, what you gain from that experience will lead to the next, to the next mountain, rather than just sort of circling. And so that's generally my attitude, which is like go for something.
And now a quick word from this week's sponsor. If you're running an e-commerce business, Whiplash is your virtual warehouse. You send your products to a Whiplash facility so that when orders come in, Whiplash packs and ships them just like you would, but faster and cheaper. Leave the logistical hassle of order fulfillment to Whiplash and save money on shipping costs while doing so. Check it out. Holiday sales shouldn't be stressful. Next time, get Whiplash. Whiplash has facilities in Detroit, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and London. Listeners of Smart People Podcast take advantage because you can get a $100 credit when signing up at getwhiplash.com/smart. That's getwhiplash.com/smart. And now back to the episode.
Right. No, I really completely agree and love that. I think it's much harder to do, you know what I mean, than to say. It's just one of those things where at least I know myself, and I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, especially as it relates to finding careers. You think, well, there is a wrong decision here. And what if it's not the perfect one? But I think that inaction is what's going to create the anxiety more so than anything.
It does, and I see this both in terms of business and in terms of the sort of whole meditation side as well, which is that we have so many choices that the range of choices becomes a burden on us, and we fear committing because of what we think we're going to give up. But I think a lot of the growth and learning that we're looking for comes from the committing, and and to younger people, to my own children even. I mean, I give this advice, which is that it doesn't matter so much what you do; it matters that you do it, and it will, because it's the engagement that will sort of craft you and mature you, and because it's like, it's wrestling with those things like the imperfection of it, so you make a choice of something and you go in there and you find, wow, this is really hard. This nonprofit that I'm doing, I don't know if it's going to work, or that my boss is driving me crazy, or, but it's navigating those things that helps us grow.
Oh, wow. I love that. I never thought of it specifically that way. The navigation of the confusion is where the growth happens.
There's no doubt about it.
Because I've thought about navigating the difficulties, obviously, right? You take a new job and then you figure it out and you go, wow, okay, I can do that. That happens. But actually working through all of the nuances of did you even make the right decision can be a growth and learning in itself. That's really great.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
And I knew that we would kind of go into that just given your background, but kind of bringing us back a little bit because there's something I want to talk about. And that's when Pixar was, essentially purchased by Disney. Tell us about that. How long was that in the works? And did that feel like the moment you made it?
Well, it didn't feel like the moment we made it. The moment we felt like we made it, if there was a moment, would have been long before at the release of Toy Story and Pixar's IPO. And that would have been like the first moment. Not that we made it, but that like we've arrived. And then following that, the next two films, like A Bug's Life, which was the second film, the fact that film was a success, that's when we started to realize that we were making it. So the Disney acquisition came along quite a number of years later. And that was more the sort of, the Disney relationship had been in existence for a very long time. It was a complicated relationship and it had lots of ups and downs. There were relationships at the creative level, at the business and legal level, and then we spoke. Now we're in like 2006, and Pixar's stock price is flying really high. And I, as a board member of Pixar, started to feel that there was a lot of risk in the stock. Just a small miss in one of Pixar's films, and the value of Pixar stock could come crashing down, and with that, much of Steve's wealth, and also the value of the stock. And so, in that kind of scenario, companies usually do one of two things. They either use that high valued stock to go buy other companies. We see that happening a lot today, with Google, Facebook, Apple, and other companies, or they merge into another company where they sort of diversify the risk of their own of their own business into a broader portfolio of businesses in the other company. So in this case, that was Disney, and so that looked like options that we should consider. And funnily enough, at the same exact time, Disney was going through a management change. Michael Eisner had sort of a campaign against him by Roy Disney, who felt he had taken his eye off the heart and soul of the Disney company, which Roy Disney felt was animation. And so then Bob Iger comes in, and we didn't know if Bob Iger was going to be how he was going to feel about it. He came up through the television business, and was he going to sort of want to breathe life into animation or not? And it turned out that Bob Iger agreed with Roy Disney 100%, and he thought there was no Disney without a really robust animation unit, and he became very favorably disposed to Pixar, and that was the kind of dynamics that led to the talks for that acquisition.
Ah, okay. One thing you mentioned is how when Toy Story made it, that was kind of okay, we did it. And I completely understand how that happens. And Toy Story was revolutionary and it was amazing. When you came to Pixar, Toy Story was currently in development, right?
Yes.
Obviously Steve kind of saw some writing on the wall, right? We need to focus. We need this business mind. We need the business plan. Do you think, say you never went and Pixar never fully focused, if Toy Story did what it ended up doing, would it have survived anyways? Would Pixar have made it anyways?
Well, that one can never answer that. Like, for example, if we hadn't been ready to do the IPO after Toy Story, I think you wouldn't have been able to do an IPO for quite some time, like several years, because the next film wasn't coming out for several years, and investors don't like, sort of a long dry spell. And so maybe that would have delayed things. I'm one of these people that, Robert Heinlein from
yes.
Fiction author, he has a quote that I love. He says, when we're ready to railroad, we railroad. Which is a way of saying that, these great technologies, whether it be railroads or airplanes or iPhones or animated feature films, or the internet, it's like, they depend on so many circumstances coming together that, when the world is ready to do it, we'll do it. So it's like saying, would we have personal computers without Steve Jobs? Would we have, Facebook? Would we have all of these things? And I'm one that believes, we probably would get to these things. It's just a question of how and when we get there. And so again, it's hard to say, with Pixar what might have happened, but the conditions all came together, back then, and that's when it happened.
Right. No, it's just interesting to think about. I guess my question more being, was Pixar and what they were creating so great, so new, that regardless of an inability to focus and perhaps, a great business plan, would the product have just spoken enough for itself that it all went on to become a success anyways? And again, I realize you can't answer that, and I understand what you were saying. That was kind of, my thought process, because sometimes maybe what we create or what the business is doing is just that good.
Yeah, that's hard to say. My experience suggests, I guess that's sometimes true, but I think it takes an enormous amount. You could write the greatest song in the world. Does that mean it would become a hit? It takes a lot of circumstances. And I think the conditions around great innovation matter. The conditions, the timing. People, like, for example, we thought to ourselves, would the public, this is before Toy Story came out, we really questioned, would the public have an appetite for, 90 minutes of computer animation? No one's ever seen 90 minutes of computer.
All right.
And they did, would they have had that 10 years before? Or it's really hard to say. So, that, and so it's really hard to say, but I do think conditions matter a lot, as well as the greatness of the innovation.
Right, absolutely. I want to move on to Juniper Foundation, but one last question, kind of about Pixar in general or the industry. But now you are fairly removed, at least in comparison to where you were. Is that a fair statement?
You mean me personally?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What do you see for kind of the state of animated movies and films going forward? What do you think of, or is that something you even think of anymore?
No, I do, and it's interesting. What I kind of see is, I think these things come in cycles, and we're in a cycle now where I would say we have a lot of sort of big bets being made on known branded franchises. And so we have a lot of sequels. We have a lot of, comic book films, Star Wars films. And so this is studios kind of extending their bet on content that we know, people like. And as opposed to new things, new innovation, new characters. And I think that this comes in cycles, and that, eventually, the public's appetite will sort of maybe demand less of that and more, just original things. And then we'll go through another cycle of looking for sort of really great, innovative new things. And then, there'll be another Pixar that, or Pixar-like company that sort of, or companies that spring up to do that. So, I see this kind of in waves.
Well, I look forward to what it brings. And I will say the Pixar films, part of yes, the animation's great, but the writing and the jokes, they're just so good.
John Lasseter used to say that great graphics, unbelievable graphics, will keep an audience in its seats for about 2 minutes.
There you go.
And it's story that keeps an audience there for 90.
Absolutely. Well, now I want to transition for the last part here that we have you and talk about a transition that you made, which was from this Silicon Valley go-getter, lawyer, businessman, CFO, all this stuff, to now, almost complete diversion into Eastern philosophy. I read, you said, I left corporate life to study Eastern philosophy and meditation and their relevance to modern life.
Yeah.
What was the impetus for that transition? I
loved my career and everything about it. From when I was a young lawyer drafting 70-page legal contracts to, taking Pixar public and crafting its strategy and all of that, it was great. But I also observed that corporate life, so to speak, can be kind of one-dimensional, and it's very focused on what I would call acquisition at all costs. It's a very performance-driven culture, and the more successful you are in a way, the more performance-driven it becomes, because public companies are driven by very short-term, growth-oriented profit goals, and so it's very easy to get caught up in that performance paradigm. And I observed that there were certain things about that. For all the great stuff it produces, all the prosperity and great products it produces, there are also hidden costs. And that it can take a toll on our lives inwardly in terms of stress and anxiety and how we feel about ourselves. And more importantly, perhaps, obscuring other things that we might do in our lives that provide even richer, deeper kinds of rewards, more fulfillment. And so I was interested in that, and I was a bit of a closet philosopher, and I was very interested in Eastern philosophy, and I just sort of had this feeling, I want to go off and find out what my movie might be like, and it was in this area of Eastern philosophy and meditation. So I decided to take a sabbatical to explore that deeply, and that sabbatical turned into a whole kind of different journey in my life, where I discovered, I think, that there is this other dimension to our lives. There are these parts of us that we can kind of wake up so that we experience life in a different way. But it doesn't, we have to put effort into that. We have to, it's like, we have to put effort into it. And so I went off on a path to understand what that was all about.
What's really difficult for me to get is, because I'm fascinated by meditation, mindfulness, something that I practice and try to get better at, but for purposes of myself and for my own benefit. But it seems like if you could take the opposite of the mindfulness idea, mentality, Eastern philosophy, it would be Silicon Valley. And so I'm wondering, given you really seeing both sides of that coin, how they can coexist.
Well, it's interesting. That's a fabulous question. We could probably do a whole podcast just on that question, but we'll do a little bit. I often ask the question, because when I teach meditation in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, I say that by every single measure of wealth, prosperity, materialism, fame, by all of those measures, when we're sitting in Silicon Valley, it ought to be utopia, right? Because
Right.
you couldn't imagine another place where you have so much education and prosperity and all these great things. And so why isn't it utopia? Why are we so stressed? Because in Silicon Valley, and that it's not the only area of the world, but we've arrived, we've made it by every conceivable measure. And my answer is always that because we've forgotten about this other side. And I actually think that what I would call, sometimes it's a little bit of a dirty word, what I would call spiritual life. The whole goal of spiritual life is to integrate it with the pressures and responsibilities of our day-to-day life. This is what I learned about it. It's not meant to be a path of escape. It's not supposed to take us away from our responsibilities. It's supposed to help us put them in perspective and bring to whatever we're doing a different richness and a different way of approach. Because you could do great work, without having to be defined by, how successful you are. Sometimes I think you can even do greater work. So opening up that door toward a meditation or opening up that spiritual door within us is a means to discover that. And I think they're meant to go together. And and that really is the work. That's why we started this foundation, is to develop the means to do that.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about Juniper Foundation, but that's a really fascinating kind of explanation that you just gave, and I enjoyed it, and I'm listening to it thinking that makes a lot of sense. But what I struggle with, having a certain disdain for a lot of kind of corporate America, or even more so, as you were talking about the I forget what you termed it, but the acquisition mentality or whatever it was, right?
I call it acquisition at all costs.
Yeah. And I mean, that is what a lot of capitalism essentially is built on. Now, you can call it that, or just, hey, we have to make as much profit as possible, and we can hide behind this fiduciary duty, or we got an IPO, or whatever it is. And I feel like that's going to take over, as opposed to this ability to be more mindful. And I don't know, it seems it's basically greed versus truth, in my opinion, to some extent. I don't know, sometimes I just feel like, well, the higher ups, or the CFOs, if you will, or the people that want to sell the company will look at you if you're bringing this idea of mindfulness, and you talk about maybe meditation or limiting stress, and say, well, we need somebody who's hard charging all the time. We don't care if we burn them out in 5 years, because then we'll have our millions.
Right. Well, again, this is the question, and in some ways, my life in some ways is dedicated to this question. I don't think this is about mindfulness and meditation and stress reduction. I think that mindfulness, meditation, and stress reduction are great, but it's not what these great ancient teachings are talking about. What they're talking about is a shift, a change in the paradigm in how we think about ourselves and our lives. Very often, the challenge is that we're living by a story. We have a story inside of us that is dictating very large amount of our experience. Story about who we are, who we should be, how we should behave. In order to really transform and grow as a human being, we have to go beyond the stories that are limiting us. So mindfulness and meditation is just the beginning. They're just kind of the tools that open the door to that. And so my take on this is that, yeah, we live in this acquisition by all costs paradigm, but that's just a paradigm. It's not some sacred truth of the universe. It just happens to be what we've been doing the last couple of hundred years. And in my mind, there's no reason that, I don't think that's the ultimate and only way that corporations can necessarily exist. And I think we're at the very beginning of a time when there's more recognition and awareness about this. Just the fact of your podcast is an example of it. And maybe it's a generational thing, but I think the work that you do, the work that I'm trying to do, can begin to affect a change in how we think about organizations and how we think about businesses, where we don't abandon, the drive to perform, but we marry it with another set of values, and it evolves to something else.
Oh, man. Well, I could not be more of a proponent. That sounds like the true utopia. Tell us a little bit more about, the Juniper Foundation. What it does. Feel free to give us your mission statement or what you would like us to know about it. I read a little bit, but I'm extremely interested to hear your take.
Well, you could certainly learn all about it at juniperpath.org, which is our website. And but the Juniper Foundation began in 2003. There were 5 co-founders: myself, my wife Hillary. We have just an extraordinary teacher, a Buddhist master whose name is Segyu Rinpoche. He's in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, but he's Western because he was born in Brazil. And 2 other co-founders, Christina Juskowitz, Pam Moriarty. And we sat down in 2003, and I had this like sort of cavalier Silicon Valley bravado, and I asked the question: is it possible to bring to contemporary life all the wisdom and depth of an ancient Indo-Tibetan meditation tradition? That was the question on the table, and we examined it for 30 days. Filling a room with whiteboards, and we came up with this blueprint which suggested how we might be able to do it. I looked at that and I said, there's no way, like, this is going to take 500 years. It's a huge task. And Segyu Rinpoche, our teacher, he said, no, it's not going to take 500 years. It'll just take 100 years. So I was like, man, are you kidding? Like, how do we take on something, that big? And he said, well, you put one foot in front of the other, and then you put the next foot in front of that. And so for the last 10 years, over 10 years now, that's what we've done. And the Juniper Foundation is basically focused on bringing this very rich collection of teachings to make it accessible in modern life. And yes, it begins with meditation, but when you look back at what these great masters in the past were talking about, they're talking about not just meditation, but they're talking about sort of an inner discipline that brings these sort of vast emotional swings that we experience under control. So how do you develop a mind? It's interesting, we think that freedom comes from, just being able to do whatever we want. But freedom, as I've understood it, actually comes from disciplining this amazing instrument that we have called the mind. And we do that through what we call balancing emotions. Lots of practices on compassion, lots of practices on developing insight and clarity. And it goes from there. So my experience with these ideas is that they're so rich that they, it's like we never sort of master all of them. They're always there to infuse our lives with kind of, wisdom and inspiration. And so the goal of Juniper is to bring that and connect it with our world.
As I mentioned, I think that's fantastic work. I hope it doesn't take 100 years. I hope it happens actually a lot more quickly for the sake of even myself, but I'm probably too old at this point, so my son. And I think that's fascinating. So thank you. Lawrence Levy, thank you so much. The book is To Pixar and Beyond, My Unlikely Journey with Steve Jobs to Make Entertainment History. And we mentioned Juniper Foundation and the website for that. Is there anywhere else that our listeners can go? Are you on social? Are you writing different places, newsletter, anything that they can connect with you?
Yes, I have a website that I created called lawrencelevy.com, and you can learn a little bit more about all of this there as well and connect with me on there.
Fantastic. Well, Lawrence, again, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Lawrence Levy. Lawrence's book, To Pixar and Beyond, My Unlikely Journey with Steve Jobs to Make Entertainment History, can be found at your local bookstore and on Amazon. And if you decide to purchase Lawrence's book through Amazon, please make sure you use the Smart People Podcast Amazon link located at smartpeoplepodcast.com/Amazon. And as you round up your holiday shopping, we ask that you use that link because it comes to no cost to you and it greatly helps out the show. And if you're looking for other free and easy ways to support the show, you can always head over to iTunes and leave a review over there. Make sure you check out Smart People Podcast, sign up for the newsletter over there, and if you'd like to reach out to the show, you can reach us via email at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com or message us on Twitter at smartpeoplepod. All right, that's it for us this week. I hope you're getting ready to spend some time with your friends and your family, and you have a fantastic new year as we say goodbye to 2016 and hope for the absolute best in 2017. If you're running an e-commerce business, Whiplash is your virtual warehouse. You send your products to a Whiplash facility so that when orders come in, Whiplash packs and ships them just like you would, but faster and cheaper. Leave the logistical hassle of order fulfillment to Whiplash and save money on shipping costs while doing so. Holiday sales shouldn't be stressful. Next time, get Whiplash. Whiplash has facilities in Detroit, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and London. And listeners of Smart People Podcast get a $100 credit when signing up at getwhiplash.com/smart. That's getwhiplash.com/smart.